Edwards, Baptists settled near Morristown in 1717. He says the Baptist interest in this part of the country had its beginning in the following. About the year 1717, one David Coble and family immigrated from Charleston, South Carolina. They, being Baptists, invited Baptist ministers to preach at their house, particularly Isaac Stell of Piscataway. And Piscataway is the second oldest Baptist church in New Jersey. By his labors and the labors of some others, several returned from darkness to light and went to Piscataway for baptism. Mr. Stell and others continued their visits and began to have many hearers. To accommodate them, the Gobles built a meeting house at their own expense, which was converted to another use when the present one was raised. The persons baptized who had joined Piscataway were John, Daniel, and Isaac Sutton, Jonas and Robert and Malaysia and Mercy Goble, Daniel Walling, Ichabod Tompkins, Sarah and Jemima Wiggins and Sarah Wiggins, Naomi Allen, Elizabeth Estelle, Elizabeth Lyons, and Sarah Osborne. These 16 persons, after being released from Piscataway, were formed into a distinct church July 11, 1752. So you have an idea of the formation of this church. Isaac Stell of Piscataway, Benjamin Miller of Scotch Plains, another Old Baptist church in the area, Isaac Eaton of Hopewell, and some of you have been to that church, endorsed their mutual fellowship and constitution as a Baptist church. What a wonderful trio of men, the book says. Their mark in the ages will never be effaced, and their memory will ever be associated with the Nazarene. Like him is their memorial. The first meeting house was built by the Gobles and was located to accommodate constituent members who all lived on farms in the immediate neighborhood, none living in the village. And it goes on to talk about the early days. But there must be a settled pastor. Who was the first pastor of the Morristown Baptist Church? John Ghano of Hopewell, who graduated in the school there, was the first pastor of Morristown. And those of you who are familiar with that great old Baptist preacher, you know the story, how that he was converted here in New Jersey. He was trained under the ministry of Isaac Eaton there in Hopewell, which was the first Baptist academy for training Baptist preachers in the country. And it's not far from here. We know that the folks here wanted Gano to come and to preach, and he did on several occasions. In fact, God called him to preach, so that's what he was going to do. We find in this little book, and this is interesting, we could make you a copy of it if you would like. We got it out of the library here. The church probably has a copy of it as well. It's called Preachers and Patriots, and it, in the first part, gives a sketch of the life of John Ghano, who would later become the chaplain there in the Revolution. And of course, some, even in this book, it casts a little doubt on the story that he baptized George Washington. Yet we know that that has been proven true time and time again. In fact, Brother Beller may tell you a story a little later on this week of finding those sworn affidavits there in the American Baptist Historic Society in Rochester. So we know that that was an actual event, and we'll get the significance of it later. But this was Gano's first pastorate, and he was here for just a short period of time. He then would go on to pastor the church there in North Carolina, Jersey Baptist Church. Some of you live near there. He would return to this area and pastor the First Baptist Church in New York City for many years. In fact, he was the pastor of it during the Revolution and afterwards. And then he would move on to Frankfort, Kentucky, where he would pastor his fourth congregation there, and he is buried in the Frankfort Cemetery, and you know that we have placed a marker at his grave there. We find it interesting that as he began to exercise his gifts, that the Baptist churches were very particular. They desired to have everything done in order. It must be done a certain way. And of course, we would do well to learn from their example. We find that Isaac Eaton, after he found out that Brother John had been exercising his gifts, not having been set apart, he brought him before the church there in Hopewell, where he was a member, and they censored him for doing it without the authority of the church. And of course, he agreed to that and said, I want to be set apart. And they licensed him and wanted him to come and answer some questions. And he left the place he was studying at the time to go answer the questions. And they asked him again to come and answer more questions. He said, I've answered all the questions I'm going to answer, so I'm not going to take time away from my study to answer any more. And so they said they wanted to hear him preach then. And he came and he preached for them several occasions. And they set him apart for the gospel ministry, and then he came here. Now, by our standards, we would think, by the way, this little book, Preachers and Patriots, was written by one of the former mayors of this town, Norman Fox. And of course, he makes the plea that there ought to be a marker here in this place for this great preacher, John Ghano, and I agree with him, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to do that. But it's interesting. Now, some of you pastor different sized churches. And don't ever be discouraged with what God is doing. Remember that the fruit is up to Him. The increase is up to Him. Ours is to be faithful. And you can take a little comfort from the ministry of John Ghano. I pastor a small church, and I'll admit it's discouraging at times that it doesn't grow the way I think that it should. But here we find that he pastored this place for around 3 years. And perhaps 4 altogether. And he had one convert. While I was in the library at the Rutgers University researching the Baptist history, I found an interesting book there from one of the early pastors of this church that recorded all of the pastors and the statistics of their ministries, the number of baptisms. And that's the way that they counted conversions in those days, folks. They counted it by the number that actually followed the Lord in believers' baptism, and they didn't count them before. And that's something different than what some of the Baptists we know are used to today. But that's what they did. And when we look at the statistics, some of those statistics had rather large numbers. Under some of the pastors, there were over 100 that were joined to this congregation while they were pastors here. But John Ghano might have been considered a failure by some of the brethren of today because he only had one convert, one person who was baptized under his ministry. Well, the Lord has all that under His control. And I think it's rather impressive. This little booklet right here says Preachers and Patriots, not a preacher and patriot, because there were actually 2 from this area that went on to become chaplains in the Revolution, as well as famous Baptist preachers. And one of them, the other, is Hezekiah Smith. He's from here as well. And when you find out that the one convert that John Ghano had in his ministry here at this place was Hezekiah Smith, boy, it really just sets things on fire for you, because Hezekiah Smith would later, he would go to Massachusetts. Some of you have been to the grave there in Haverhill, Massachusetts, where he is buried. He pastored the First Baptist Church in that town for many years, but he'd go over into New Hampshire and Vermont. And he'd be a great church planter. He'd start churches in those areas. Many, many churches started by Hezekiah Smith, and many souls saved in that area. And you know what? John Ghano only had one convert that he could show during his time here. But look at all the fruit that came from that one. And folks, that's what we want to pray. It's not God, give us what we want. But God, you know what we need. And God, you know what you're doing. And God, I'm going to follow you. And I'm going to be obedient. I'm going to be faithful. And God, if you'll bless, then that's what I'll be pleased with. And we must submit those things to Him.